Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Sigrid Veasey, a physician scientist at the University of Pennsylvania who studies what chronic sleep disruption does to the brain at a molecular level. Her research shows that repeated short sleep and sleep fragmentation can injure and even kill wake-active neurons. But most strikingly, her lab has discovered that chronic sleep loss can damage locus coeruleus neurons, which is then associated with a degenerative cascade that spreads through the forebrain. Dr. Veasey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here and glad you guys are taking interest in sleep.
That's good. So, my first question for you is what first got you interested in studying the biology of sleep?
I think what's most interesting about sleep research is that it still is a new frontier in medicine. It's an area that, despite the fact that we all sleep and all animals have some rest activity patterns consistent with sleep, it is one of the greatest mysteries. And so that was one of the reasons. As a physician scientist, I realized that some of my patients with different sleep disorders, even when we treated the sleep disorders, they were still sleepy. And because the sleepiness persisted, it brought up the possibility that there could be injury to the brain from the sleep disorders. And so that really was the initial pursuit for my work.
Yeah. So, you just mentioned like the association of sleep with brain injury, and I know a lot of your work connects this chronic sleep loss with harming neurons. So, could you elaborate a little bit on this work?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting, and I would say that it's also controversial in the sense that most people hate or are horrified with the thought that the brain could be injured by sleep loss, right? And
Yeah.
so it's sort of like, oh, that can't happen, that can't happen.
Yeah.
Um, and it probably happens only to subsets of neurons. And probably the bigger effects are changes that happen at synapses. And I can give you several examples from humans all the way down to like animal models for how this occurs. So in humans, if you take young adult healthy humans and sleep deprive them or shorten their sleep down to like 4 hours or 5 hours a night for 7 days in a row, and you're really careful. They're brought into a lab and you're really careful about making sure that's all the sleep they get. They're not getting sleep at other times. And then you start to do a test on them, which is looking at their attention span with this really boring test on a computer screen. And every time a light comes up, they have to have a response, but it comes up intermittently. So they get really bored with it. It's called the psychomotor vigilance test. But this is the same task that you need for being a safe driver going down the road. Right? It's you have to pay attention. It's you being a good student in class. It's you listening to anything. This sustained attention. And what they found in this study was after the 1 week, the people did not return to their normal baseline after 2 nights of full recovery sleep, 4 nights after recovery sleep, 6 nights out of recovery sleep. So we don't really know when they do recover, but we know that there is a prolonged impairment in humans with short sleep. And we also know that in humans, if you sleep deprive after you have learned something, and this is really relevant to students who are studying and pulling all-nighters for exams, that the ability to consolidate that material and turn it into long-term memory is greatly impaired by sleep loss. And that also suggests that there's synaptic dysfunction potentially in the hippocampus and other memory areas going up to the front of the brain. We get a better look at what happens with sleep loss looking at animal models. And
Yeah.
in animal models, whether it's in flies or worms or in mice, when you do sleep deprivation, you can, with prolonged sleep deprivation, increase injury. The locus coeruleus neurons are noradrenergic neurons. They are your fight or flight hormone
Yeah.
neurons. And so as soon as you have to do something like, oh my God, I have to rescue someone out of a house, those neurons are firing fast and furiously. Those neurons are really susceptible to sleep loss, very easy to get injured, and those neurons get lost and they don't come back. Even in mice left looked at a year later, the neurons are still gone. And so that's probably one of the more pronounced injury. That injury is also relevant because people with chronic sleep deprivation have an increased risk for anxiety disorders and for depression. And that's frequently seen in high school students
Yeah.
have probably that high school students are very sleep deprived, right?
Yeah.
Like
And I
you
think
should
part of it is like the school start times too.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy. So you
Yeah.
should be getting like 8 to 9 hours of sleep.
Right.
People are lucky if they're getting, seven
Yeah.
hours of sleep, and 6 hours might be pretty typical. So,
Yeah.
and with that comes not really, maybe not a full-blown depression, but if somebody is predisposed to depression, it can shift them more into a depressed mood. And that may also be locus coeruleus dysfunction because norepinephrine is important for mood, as is serotonin.
Yeah.
So, so that may be part of it. And then the other things that we have seen in mice is that if you do the other area of the brain that gets impacted is the hippocampus, which is important for memory. And so if you test mice on various spatial tests, do they remember the spatial context of something? That is impaired after sleep loss, whether it's chronic sleep fragmentation or short sleep. And that's also an irreversible change. And then the final change that we know from the mouse studies is that you can increase amyloid and you can increase tau, the two proteins associated with Alzheimer's
Yeah.
disease and other forms of dementia, that those can increase in the brain. And in humans, there's one intriguing study where humans were sleep deprived and they did one of those brain imaging studies of amyloid and showed that the amyloid was increased in a specific part of the hippocampus after
Yeah.
sleep loss. And so we think it's pretty it probably happens across all different species. There can certainly be some short sleepers who simply don't need to sleep. But if you are catching up on sleep on the weekend, you need it and you should get it.
Yeah. So, you mentioned like the hippocampus being affected, and this is kind of just a question that came up as you were explaining. I'm curious, is like, so there's multiple aspects to what like the hippocampus does. So, is encoding like and retrieval like affected equally, or is one affected more than another when we're talking about this kind of damage that occurs in the hippocampus?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and we haven't done the elegant studies to require that, so we can say that there is a an impairment in learning and memory. We think it's more with the actual consolidation because
Okay.
the short-term memory seems to be okay. So if you test the mice in the spatial object recognition kind of a thing, 3 hours later they do okay. So it seems that they're learning the test, and the same thing for that Morris water maze where they have to swim to a little platform. They
Yeah.
can do the short term, but it's that consolidation of the memory. And so whether that is a hippocampal specific impairment or whether it's the part where the memory is supposed to be taken up into the forebrain, the
Yeah.
anterior cingulate cortex for consolidation. It'll be somewhere in that realm.
Yeah. And then another question I had actually relating to your explanation is about the like locus coeruleus neurons. So is there any explanation for why these specific neurons may be affected more in particular than let's say like another group of neurons somewhere else in the brain?
Yeah, that's a really good question because in wakefulness, many different neurons are activated. And in fact, if you look at the overall brain, one of the ways that we characterize sleep is looking at the EEG, the brain waves, and we
Yeah.
see, particularly in slow wave sleep, that everything is unbelievably slowly synchronized, and wakefulness is a highly active time.
Yeah.
And so the vast majority of neurons are more active during waking. One thing that sets the locus coeruleus neurons aside, as well as some of the other wake active neurons, is that for whatever reason, those neurons are not myelinated and they have there's such tiny little nuclei that are down in the brain stem, and yet
Yeah.
they send projections literally to every aspect of the brain and everything
Yeah.
down in the spinal cord. So they have so many collaterals. And then
Yeah.
one of the other and so then they're sending, their neurotransmitters down all the time. So the little
Yeah.
guys are working incredibly hard. And then one of the other issues that they have is that some of the byproducts or the metabolites of making norepinephrine spew off a lot of free radicals,
Okay, yeah,
and so
yeah,
there's
that
a
makes
lot of oxidative stress damage.
okay.
And then and one of the biggest challenges with all of that is that if you are firing, you're starting to send a lot of mitochondria and the norepinephrine, et cetera, down to your distal synapses. But if they're really tired, it's really hard to get those sick mitochondria back up to the cell body to then, repair them or go through autophagy and fix what needs to be fixed. And
Yeah,
so you can end up with like a point of no return because you have just like completely tapped out the cell. So it's probably a combination of a lot of things, the
yeah,
collaterals, the no myelin, et cetera.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm actually curious as to why they're not like myelinated because I was assuming like under the impression that if it's fight or flight, like speed would be of essence. So I'm curious how like that could be explained maybe. Like, do you have any?
Yeah, that also is a good question, and I don't think anyone has any idea why those particular neurons are not.
Yeah.
One reason that it's good that they're not is that they don't just release norepinephrine right out of a classic little synapse at the end of an axon, but they can send it out the sides of the axons as well. And so if
Okay.
you were insulated
Oh,
with
I
myelin,
see.
you wouldn't
Yeah,
be able to
that makes
get that out as well. So
yeah,
that may be one of the reasons. Yeah.
yeah. And so now we can kind of backtrack to like a more macro level. I guess we got pretty cellular
Yeah.
there. But so
Yeah.
we've been talking about like sleep loss, right? And that's a
Yeah.
term I feel like that in general can mean a lot of specific things. And one specific question I had is how sleep fragmentation compares with like shorter sleep in general and how like there may have different effects or just like the differences between them in general that I don't think are very
Yeah. Yeah.
obvious when we like say them out loud.
Yeah, and let me I'll put it in the clinical context. We see a lot of sleep fragmentation in obstructive sleep apnea, very common disease.
Yeah.
Many people will have parents who have obstructive sleep apnea, loud snoring, but every once in a while there's a pause in the snoring, and that's an apnea or a shortened breath, and then they wake up with a snore, and when they do
Uh,
that, they have an arousal, and
okay.
that clipping of the sleep also every time they have an arousal that springs the locus coeruleus back to life like really fast
Yeah.
levels of locus coeruleus. You can get even more intense bursts right with an arousal than you do just across waking.
Yeah.
Um, and so it is a very different pattern, but it might be in obstructive sleep apnea and other reasons like people who have chronic pain, old people, et cetera, will have increased fragmentation of sleep that may increase locus coeruleus activity.
Yeah.
And chronic short sleep, then, we would consider anything that is causing a person to have some fatigue at some point across their 24-hour cycle. So people might have short sleep because they are shift workers, and so many people have incredibly long commutes to their work. So they might have an hour and a
Yeah.
half commute to a job that starts at 7 o'clock, but but they have to get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, and
Yeah.
that's not really compatible with their family lifestyle. So they too will have short. So it's very common to have short sleep, not just in high school or college,
Right.
but well beyond that. All of the 24/7 professions. So people who are working in hospitals, people, the police, the fire, et cetera, air traffic controllers, et cetera,
Yeah.
all have these long hours. So they're all very common. From what we have seen, they all cause the same types of injury in the brain. They all involve the locus coeruleus, they all involve the hippocampus, they all increase amyloid and tau. We don't really know the specifics for how else they might be different. There probably is a lot more to be looked at to figure
Okay.
that out.
Yeah. And kind of related to this topic of like sleep loss in general. This one may not like seem like sleep loss, but I'm just curious how this connects to your research and maybe any like explanations you have for this. So I know there's like night shift workers, there's people who like adapt themselves to like different schedules. And I was actually at a Veterans Health Hackathon a few months ago, and I was talking to someone who worked on a submarine, and they have like 18-hour days where they're sleeping for
Yeah.
6 hours and awake for 12 hours, I believe. And I'm just curious, like, let's say they like quote unquote like adapt their bodies to these like atypical schedules, like whether it's a night shift or like a different kind of like sleep schedule. Are they ever like truly adapted? Is there still like some level of damage perhaps in the locus coeruleus? I guess if you could just talk about that, I'm curious.
Yeah, yeah. What we can say is that what we know very well in humans is that it's a very similar picture to having some other sort of a chronic illness. If you had, for instance, we see diabetics and their sugar is out of control for a really long time, and yet they're functioning and they feel okay, or an asthmatic who's poorly controlled, but they've been that way for a really long time. They feel okay. People with these sleep short sleep cycles like that, and we see it with our interns and residents in the hospital as well,
Yeah.
is that when they start one of these rigorous rotations where they aren't going to be getting much sleep, the first few nights they feel like, oh, this is horrible, I'm so tired, and
Yeah.
then they start feeling less tired. So that is called your subjective sleepiness, and so the subjective response looks like it levels out and you might actually get used to sleep loss. However, that same test that I was telling you about, that's the psychomotor vigilance test, where you ask, can they, what's their response reaction time for seeing a light on a screen time and time again. They have very impaired performances. And so what happens over time is you think you're okay, but your performance has deteriorated. And that's probably even a more dangerous situation, right? Because
Yeah.
then you're not going to realize how terrible it is, how dangerous it is for you to be
Yeah.
driving or operating machinery or making critical
Like,
decisions on a
yeah.
nuclear sub.
Or like for patients
So
too, I guess.
exactly,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. And I should say that attention is the most important thing that is impaired by sleep loss. The other thing that gets impaired by sleep loss is it's everything that distinguishes humans. It's the complex thought and reason and in the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex. And So if you, for instance, you're in that submarine, you might think you're doing okay, but what might happen is you can't put together five different pieces of information to make the right decision.
Yeah.
And that's one of the really scary parts where people think they're okay, but they don't really acclimate to the
Yeah.
schedules. Yeah,
Yeah, like I have to tell you, whenever I talk about like sleep deprivation on the podcast, every single time the same thing comes up. It's where people like who are sleep deprived don't think they're sleep deprived. If anything, they think they're like completely fine. And really the only way you can tell is through like those objective tests like the one you mentioned. And I just think it's so like
yeah,
important to like realize that and also
yeah.
like understand its implications like you meant like you talked
I
about. Yeah.
totally agree, and I also feel like one thing that people should listeners should think about is give yourself a sleep holiday and
Yeah.
actually just like really catch up on a lot of sleep for a week. We're past the Christmas holidays, so that's
Yeah.
not going to work. But maybe for spring break or something, really
Yeah.
focus on if you really were to get like 8 to 9 hours a night. Is your mood? How is your level of interest?
Yeah.
How is your efficiency better? Because what I can tell you from my own experience is that I just know that I'm so much more efficient when I'm well
Yeah.
rested, so I can get all the work done in a much shorter time if I get the sleep. And
Yeah.
you're sort of like, chasing your tail. If you're not getting enough sleep, then
Yeah.
you're working more slowly, and so then you're getting less sleep again and you're in
Yeah.
a vicious
Yeah.
cycle. So it's really valuable just to give yourself that sort of even if
Yeah.
you think you're doing really, really well,
Yeah.
give yourself a sleep vacation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like how you described that. Like for me personally, I feel like I'm a lot happier and that allows me to get a lot more work done because I enjoy doing whatever it is I have to do more. So,
Right.
yeah. And
Yeah.
it's funny
Yeah.
that you mentioned
Yeah.
this too because it leads into my next question, which is so let's talk about like damage from sleep disruption. Let's say like for example, you have a rotation or a shift for a few months and you're getting like very little sleep. You feel sleep deprived constantly. And let's say you have like a holiday for like a month. Like you're just off off for a month. Is any of the damage that may have occurred, maybe perhaps in the locus coeruleus, is any of this like reversible to an extent?
Yeah, you know what we don't know is how reversible that is in humans. We
Okay.
know in the mice that it's not. So we can do the studies in the mice and then put them back in their colony. They're sleeping whenever they want to sleep for a whole year. And we look at the brain and the locus coeruleus is not improved. So we know that there are some irreversible changes in mice, but who knows what that means for humans? Are we going to be different with our sleep loss, et cetera? And and so, no one has really done. We can do that. Those are actually studies that can be done. There are new studies that are able to look at the way the pupil responds to light. The pupil will dilate or constrict
Yeah.
in response to how much light there is, and that is a pretty good locus coeruleus norepinephrine effect. And so
Interesting.
there probably are studies you could do now where you could take people before and after these rotations and you could actually look at the pupillary responses before and after, and are they impaired immediately after sleep loss, and then do they start to get better? And that would probably give a better idea. So it's a studyable thing, but it hasn't been done yet.
Yeah. And I guess they might be too tired to want to participate. But yeah. So I only have two more questions for you, but these are more like broader and bigger scope. So, from your research, like experienced sleep medicine, and just in general, your expertise in the field, what is one thing you think, or what is one of the biggest things you think is misunderstood by the public about the effects of sleep or the importance of sleep, in just in general, like one effect that sleep has?
I think we're starting to realize that sleep is not just important for the brain, but really the entire body.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I think that's probably a really important point because it there probably are many different sleep disorders that are impacted. I mean, many different physical
Yeah.
changes, whether it's diabetes, uh, uh, the function of the gastrointestinal tract, liver function that are really affected by sleep. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think understanding that it's probably the whole body and not just the brain. Yeah.
And this actually reminds me. So I was reading the book Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew
Yeah, Matt
Walker a
Walker.
couple months
Yeah.
ago. And in the beginning of the book, like he talks about the question, like asking a lot of people ask, like, why do we sleep? Like what's the reason? What's like a concrete answer?
Yeah.
But over the next few chapters, like you end up realizing the real question is what isn't affected by sleep, right? Like it's really like interesting to think
Yeah.
about how like circadian rhythms, sleep, like are connected like throughout the entire body. And it's not something that like I think when I was younger I would have like realized until like I've spent so much time like studying this and like
Yeah.
appreciating
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
interconnected everything really is.
Yeah, and I would say that probably one of the other aspects is that's the misunderstood, but probably really important to appreciate is that in sleep the brain is doing a heck of a lot of work. There is a ton going on in
Mm.
the
Yeah.
brain. And some of the newest studies really show that you have to get into slow wave sleep to
Yeah.
be able to form new synapses and improve synaptic strength and improve the synaptic strength that so that you understand some general principle in calculus and you weaken a synapse of where you parked your car at Target last week or
Yeah.
something. So it's that fixing the signal to noise in the brain is
Yeah.
probably something where sleep is a really valuable
Yeah.
purpose. And so it's not a waste of time.
Yeah. It's not just like
Yeah,
everything turns off for
yeah,
a couple
yeah,
hours
yeah.
and turns back
Exactly,
on, right? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I guess like another way to think about it is like evolutionarily, there's a reason that I think pretty
Oh,
much
yeah.
all life like has some sort of like related
Right,
mechanism some way or
right,
another. So
right. Yeah, absolutely. And those are those other species. It's really in flies where it was sort of figured out, well, you have to sleep for gut integrity. So for the
oh
whole
yeah.
so that you don't get bacteria tr moving across the mucosa in the gut,
Yeah.
you have to have sleep. So it's really been and we know that sleep is really important for growth hormone. So
Yeah. Yeah.
kids who aren't sleeping will fall off their growth chart as they're getting older. It'll sort of
Yeah.
flatten out, and then it's like, oh, maybe they have, a problem with the tonsils and have sleep apnea or something. So, yeah, it many physical aspects
Yeah.
that are key. Yeah.
Yeah. So my final question is looking forward to the future. So looking ahead for the next or over the next 5, 10, 15 years, what developments in sleep research or medicine excite you the most?
Yeah, I mean, I'm excited by by all of it because I think it's just a
Yeah.
really cool field. But I would
Yeah.
say that, I'd say that we have tremendous, as a physician, I can say we have tremendous limitations in sleep medicine. The fact that we're putting a mask on someone's face hooked up to an air pump to treat sleep apnea, or they have to get a nerve stimulation device implanted, and we don't have a medication for that is crazy. I would say that most of our sleeping pill medicines are not good, don't actually enhance sleep in a healthy way. So I think looking forward, I really want to see that that sleep medicine catches up with some of the new research where we really have
Yeah.
identified new neurochemicals playing a role in sleep wake, and we can use that information to develop new medications to really improve sleep medicine delivery.
Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah. So on
Thanks.
that note, on that note, thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. VC. It was a pleasure talking to you. This is probably one of the, well, I think this is the best conversation I've had about sleep this year. But
For 2026.
yeah,
That's excellent. Yeah,
yeah. So
yeah.
I'm starting the year off right for sure.
Excellent. That's right. That's
Yeah,
good. All right.
yeah.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.